Next day, they play around the Weeble cottage.
Spinning. Breaking.
This GAFU mess is a lot of fun.
They were everywhere, on your shelves, in your kitchen, under your bed, and somehow they all vanished without a goodbye. What happened to the everyday treasures that once made the 1970s feel like home? They were not just for carrying sandwiches and juice boxes. They were badges of honor. In the 1970s, metal lunchboxes with cartoon characters were everything to a kid. You marched into school like you owned the place if you had the Brady Bunch, Scooby-Doo, or Fat Albert slung over your arm. They clanged when you walked, chipped when you dropped them, and smelled like peanut butter forever. But they were yours. The thermos inside matched the design, with a plastic cup that screwed on top and often leaked just enough milk to give the lunchbox that signature sour scent. You would line them up on the windowsill during class or hide secret notes inside the lid. The paint would eventually chip, the latches would rust, but you never wanted to give it up. Today, they have been replaced by soft-sided, logo-free lunch carriers. But for those who grew up in that era, seeing one again brings back the sound of the bell, the taste of a bologna sandwich, and that magical feeling of opening your box and hoping you got a Hostess cupcake instead of raisins. They were loud, proud, and deeply personal. One glance at the dented metal, and the memories rush back like a school bell in September. Tang was not just a drink, it was a symbol of the future. Pitched as the beverage astronauts drank in space, this orange-powdered miracle made you feel like you were participating in the space race from your own kitchen. Every kid wanted Tang. Every mom kept a jar in the cupboard. All you needed was water and a spoon, and suddenly you were sipping the same stuff that orbited the Earth. It was sweet, artificial, and packed with flavor. And it made you feel cool. The powder never fully dissolved, which meant gritty sips near the end were just part of the experience. If you got the scoop size right, you earned that perfect bright orange glow. Too much, and it was syrupy sludge. Too little, and it was just sad orange water. Tang was more than a drink, it was a cultural event. The jar was wide and squat with a screw-on lid, and every household seemed to have one. Kids felt proud making it on their own. No adult needed. It became the go-to for lunch, after school, and Saturday cartoons. You never questioned the science behind it. You just knew that if it was good enough for NASA, it was good enough for you. That dusty scoop brought the cosmos into your kitchen. In the 1970s, you could walk into any living room and find a macrame plant hanger swaying near the window. Handmade from twisted cords, thick yarn, or even old rope, these hangers were more than decoration. They were statements. Your mom or aunt probably made one at a craft night or picked one up at a flea market. They cradled ferns, spider plants, and anything green, sometimes hanging over orange shag carpeting or wood-paneled walls. Some had beads woven into the strands. Others had patterns that seemed to hypnotize you if you stared too long. They were often hung with a brass hook screwed right into the ceiling, dangerously close to ceiling fans or light fixtures. But no one cared. It was groovy. It was artistic. It was freedom and nature brought indoors. The macrame craze represented a return to earthiness and personal touch. You were not just buying a product, you were tying every knot yourself. And if you were not making one, someone you knew definitely was. These hangers aged, gathered dust, sometimes sagged under too much weight, but they were beloved. They matched the houseplants perfectly and brought warmth into every room. Seeing one today might feel like stepping into your grandmother's sunroom on a quiet afternoon, the scent of potting soil and lemon-scented furniture polish in the air. The kitchen of the 1970s did not just serve food, it made a statement. And that statement was harvest gold and avocado green. These two colors dominated every American kitchen appliance. Your refrigerator, your stove, even your blender wore these colors like a uniform. It was not just paint, it was identity. These colors were supposed to represent nature, health, and a touch of luxury. Harvest gold had a warm golden glow that felt like sunlight. Avocado green was earthy and bold, a perfect match for the indoor plant movement and natural fiber craze of the time. But somewhere along the way, the trend turned into a punchline. Yet, for those who lived it, there is no forgetting. You remember the heavy click of the fridge door, the way the green surface reflected your face in the oven window, the hum of the blender making root beer floats. These were not sleek or modern. They were sturdy, reliable, and filled with the smells of Sunday dinners and burnt toast. Maybe you were not fond of these colors as a kid. Maybe you even hated them. But when you see them now, something deep inside stirs. They are more than colors. They are the palette of your childhood. If you remember clacker toys, you probably also remember getting smacked in the face. These were two solid acrylic balls connected by a string, meant to be swung up and down until they clacked together above and below your hand. That was the whole toy. No batteries, no screen. Just two hard spheres ready to leave a bruise. And kids loved them. The louder and faster they clacked, the cooler you were. It was a skill to master. Get the rhythm right, and you could keep them going for minutes. Get it wrong, and you got a nasty surprise. Parents hated them. Teachers banned them. Hospitals probably kept a few on hand just to demonstrate what not to do. They were loud, dangerous, and oddly satisfying. For a few wild years, clackers were everywhere, on sidewalks, in classrooms, and hidden under beds when they got taken away. Eventually, safety concerns shut them down, but not before a generation got their fill of noise and near misses. They were outlawed in some places, but that only made them cooler. If you ever got them moving just right, you remember the thrill, and maybe a headache to go with it. They were chaos in toy form, and we would not have had it any other way. Mood rings promised to read your soul. Slip one on, and suddenly your finger was a window into your emotions. Or so we thought. The magic came from a tiny, color-changing stone set into a thick metal or plastic band. It shifted hues depending on temperature, but as kids, we believed it told the truth. If it turned blue, you were calm. If it went black, you were angry. Green? Maybe in love. We studied those little charts that came with the ring like they were sacred scrolls. Every recess and sleepover had at least one person interpreting moods. Sure, the science was sketchy, and sure, it mostly just reflected how cold or hot your hands were, but to us, it was real magic. It felt like the ring knew something we did not. Every kid had one, lost one, or begged their parents to buy one from a gas station or gift shop. The band turned your finger green eventually, but you wore it anyway. It was a talisman, a tiny crystal mood detector that let you feel seen, even if it was just a gimmick. To this day, nothing quite compares to the mystery and wonder packed into one shimmering, shifting little stone. Long before music was digital, it spun on plastic. Record players with built-in speakers were the backbone of every teenager's room and every family living room. They were bulky, boxy, and usually brown or beige. But when you placed that needle on the groove, the room changed. You might remember hearing the Jackson 5, the Carpenters, or Fleetwood Mac for the very first time through one of these machines. The sound was warm, slightly fuzzy, and crackled at the edges, but it was alive. Kids would stack their 45s, adjust the tone arm, and lower the needle with care. These were not sleek devices. They were furniture. Some had lids that closed like a suitcase. Others had knobs you had to gently coax into the right spot. Volume? Not much. But intimacy? All the way. You sat close to it. You knew every skip and scratch on your favorite record. You could play the same song 10 times in a row and it felt new every time. It was not about convenience, it was about connection. The record player was not background noise, it was the centerpiece of your downtime. Hearing one today might just make you stop, listen, and remember who you were when that song first played. Playgrounds used to be a little more dangerous, and the metal slide on asphalt was the crown jewel of poor design. In the 1970s, nearly every school or park had one. It stood tall, often 2 stories high, baking in the sun until it could sear the back of your legs. No shade, no padding, just you, gravity, and a prayer. The steps up were made of thin metal bars. The top had no real guardrails, and when you slid down, You hit that blacktop like a dropped steak, but we lined up for it anyway, over and over. There was something thrilling about the danger. It was a rite of passage, a fast, hot, jolting ride that ended in a dusty scrape or bruised elbow. Teachers watched from afar. Parents shrugged. Kids were expected to bounce back. If you made it to the bottom without a scream, you earned bragging rights. If you got burned, you wore it like a badge. Safety standards have come a long way since then, but so much of that fearless, feral childhood play was tied to moments like these. Today, it is hard to believe we once thought that was normal, but deep down, part of us misses it. Shrinky Dinks were magic in plastic form. You started with a sheet, clear, flexible, and begging to be colored. You grabbed your markers, drew a wild design, cut it out with safety scissors, and popped it in the oven. What came out was a tiny, hardened version of your masterpiece, often warped but always perfect. Watching it shrink behind the oven door was part of the thrill. You would kneel on the floor, peering through the glass, and gasp as your drawing curled, twisted, and finally flattened. Kids made keychains, jewelry, ornaments. Whatever their imagination allowed, it felt like crafting with sorcery. One minute you were tracing cartoons or making friendship tags. The next you held a miniaturized relic in your palm. The smell of melting plastic filled the kitchen. Parents worried, but no one stopped us. Shrinky Dinks were affordable, creative, and wildly popular at every sleepover and birthday party. You could even buy branded kits, superheroes, cartoon characters, holiday themes. But the best ones were always your originals. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing your art transformed like that. Tiny, tough, and totally unique. We never questioned the process. We just knew it felt like creating something real, something small that still felt huge. Before the sleek inline skates of the 1990s, there were the clunky, lovable roller skates with metal wheels. They strapped over your shoes with thick leather buckles and screeched across every surface like they were mad at the floor. If you skated indoors, you sounded like a marching band. If you braved the sidewalk, every crack was a threat. But none of that mattered. Because once you got going, it was freedom. You were flying, wobbling, yes, but flying. These skates had no padding, no ankle support, and no mercy. But they came with memories, rolling through driveways, circling the garage, racing your siblings until someone wiped out. You remember the sound they made on concrete, the clatter as you tried to stop, the feeling of falling and getting back up anyway. Roller discos made them iconic. Kids and teens glided under colored lights, surrounded by Bee Gees and Donna Summer, feeling cooler than they ever had. You might have never mastered the spin. You probably fell more than you want to admit. But those skates, those metal-wheeled monstrosities, were the soundtrack to a whole chapter of growing up. They were heavy, loud, and impossible to forget. Before Bluetooth speakers and streaming playlists, there was the Fisher-Price record player, and it was a masterpiece of childhood simplicity. You wound it up with a chunky white knob and placed a thick plastic disc on the turntable. It clicked into place, and when the needle dropped, the magic began. Out came twinkly, music box-style versions of nursery rhymes, folk songs, and lullabies. The songs were short, cheerful, and unforgettable. The discs were colorful and clunky, with molded ridges that somehow produced melodies. It did not matter if the sound was a little warped or off-key. You were in control. You had your own music machine. For many kids, this was their first experience playing music, and the pride that came with it was unmatched. You could stack your favorite discs. You could play the same one on repeat until it drove your parents up the wall. And the best part? No batteries. Just your hands, your ears, and your imagination. You did not need to understand how it worked. You just needed to hear that familiar click, feel the turn of the crank, and know that something sweet was about to happen. It was low-tech joy in a beige plastic box, and it never stopped playing in our heads. In the 1970s, getting a TV signal felt like summoning the spirits. You did not just turn on the television and sit back, you had to work for it. That meant rabbit ears. That meant stretching, adjusting, and holding metal rods in every direction. And when the fuzz would not go away, there was only one solution: tin foil. It crinkled, it sparkled, and somehow it worked. Wrapped like a desperate science experiment, your television antenna became a sculpture of hope and frustration. You might remember your sibling being the designated antenna holder, standing on one leg, arm raised, frozen in place while the rest of the family watched. It was trial and error, comedy, and chaos. The goal? A clear picture, even if it only lasted 5 minutes. There were always threats not to move, begging someone not to breathe too hard, cheering when the static cleared, booing when it came back. It was not just about the picture, it was about the ritual, the teamwork, the sacrifice. You learned patience, you learned creativity. You learned that a ball of tin foil could mean the difference between watching your favorite show or sitting in silence. It was frustrating, ridiculous, and completely unforgettable. The Viewmaster was not just a toy, it was a portal. You held it up to your face like binoculars, clicked the lever, and entered a new world, one tiny slide at a time. These were not just pictures. They were 3D windows into places you had never been and shows you loved. Suddenly, Bugs Bunny was popping out at you. You were walking through Disneyland or swimming under the sea. The images were bright, bold, and vivid, especially when the sunlight hit just right. The reels came in paper packets, labeled like treasure maps, each one promising a new adventure, and you kept them all, in shoeboxes, in drawers, maybe scattered across the floor until your mom made you pick them up. The Viewmaster made you feel like a traveler, even if you never left your room. It was quiet entertainment. No batteries, no wires, no screens. Just your imagination and a satisfying click with every slide. The joy was in the anticipation. What will the next picture be? Where will I go next? You could spend hours lost in it. You remember how your arms got tired, but you kept clicking. One more reel. One more journey. Because for those few minutes, the world was just you and the magic inside that plastic viewer. Backyard fun in the 1970s was loud, chaotic, and often a little dangerous. Enter the water wiggle. It looked innocent enough. A smiling plastic head connected to a long hose. But the moment the water was turned on, it became a wild, whipping, serpentine menace. It sprayed water in every direction and flailed unpredictably, turning the yard into a circus of screams and soaked clothes. Kids chased it. It chased them back. You never knew where it would go. One second it was dancing in the air. The next it was smacking you in the shins. It had one job: to create watery mayhem, and it was great at it. Parents watched from porches, laughing or nervously sipping iced tea. Some turned the pressure down. Others cranked it up. Either way, you ended up drenched. There were no safety labels or slow modes, just you, the hose, and the wiggling chaos that could knock over toddlers and send dogs running. It was thrilling, it was unpredictable, and it was absolutely beloved. They do not make toys like that anymore, probably for good reason. But those summer afternoons when laughter mixed with shrieks and the sprinkler twisted through the air like a possessed noodle, those are hard to forget. Before you could run to the freezer aisle for a rainbow box of treats, there was Mom's kitchen. And in that kitchen were Tupperware popsicle molds, pastel-colored, slightly sticky, and always in the bottom drawer. You filled them with orange juice, Kool-Aid, or whatever soda was left over. Then you popped on the plastic stick tops, placed them in the freezer, and waited. The waiting was the hardest part. You checked every 10 minutes, you tapped the sides, you asked Mom if they were ready yet. And finally, when they were frozen solid, you ran to the counter and twisted. Sometimes they slid right out. Sometimes you had to run them under warm water for what felt like forever. But the result was always worth it. Homemade popsicles, cold, sweet, and uneven. One might be syrupy, another mostly ice. You never knew, but it was yours. Made by you. That tiny sense of accomplishment melted faster than the treat itself. Sticky fingers, drips down your arm. A moment of pride on a hot afternoon. Tupperware popsicle molds were not flashy, but they were practical, nostalgic, and endlessly fun. Long before popsicles came in plastic wrappers with cartoon mascots, this was the taste of summer at home. Pop beads were not just a craft, they were a lifestyle. These chunky, colorful plastic beads snapped together with a satisfying click, turning into necklaces, bracelets, tiaras, or anything else your imagination dreamed up. Every little girl had a box of them. Every slumber party included at least one fashion show. But pop beads were more than accessories. They were building blocks. They were puzzles. They were surprisingly strong and endlessly versatile. You could pull them apart to start over or wear your creation all day like it was made of gold. They came in every color of the rainbow. Some were clear, some were glittery, some looked like tiny candies. And yes, sometimes you chewed on them even though you were not supposed to. Sometimes they turned into weapons, flicked across the room or used to bind your younger sibling. That was half the fun. Pop beads were part toy, part rebellion. They made you feel creative, independent, grown up even, until one popped off and vanished under the couch, never to be seen again. You always lost one, but the set never felt incomplete. You just made a shorter necklace. Pop beads were a rite of passage in childhood, bright, noisy, and totally unforgettable. The big wheel tricycle was not quiet. It was not smooth. It did not have gears or brakes or padding, but in the 1970s, it was everything. Made of hard plastic, it sat low to the ground with a giant front wheel and two tiny ones in back. It made you feel fast, cool, and slightly invincible. The handlebars squeaked, the wheels clicked. Every turn was a drift. Every ride was a race. You could spin out on the sidewalk like a stunt driver. You could chase your friends down the block, legs pumping wildly, plastic wheels screaming in protest. The seat usually wobbled, the stickers peeled off after a week. But none of that mattered. The big wheel was freedom. It did not look like a tricycle. It looked like something better, sleeker, edgier. You did not just ride it. You rode into battle, or the corner store, or the backyard dirt track you called the racetrack. It scuffed your shoes. It burned holes in your knees. But you loved it. There was something about sitting that low, hearing the thunder of your wheels and feeling like you could outrun the whole neighborhood. For a generation of kids, it was not just a toy, it was a throne. Before streaming, before boomboxes, there was the Handheld AM transistor radio. It fit in your palm, had a tiny metal antenna, and brought the world to your ears one scratchy signal at a time. You turned a dial hoping for a station that came in clear, sometimes music, sometimes baseball, sometimes late-night talk that made you feel like an adult. The static was constant, the sound was tinny, but the magic was undeniable. You could carry it anywhere, into the backyard, under the covers, on long car rides. It was your secret channel to everything that mattered. Some had fake wood paneling, others were neon or chrome. You might remember using a single earbud, just one, while your parents talked nearby. That little radio was a lifeline to top 40 hits, to the ball game score, to stories told in the dark, and you treated it like treasure. Batteries died fast, but you always had spares. You knew the stations by heart, and even when the sound cut out, you waited, hoping it would come back. That simple, static-filled box gave you a sense of independence. You were connected to something bigger. Even if all you got was weather and warnings, it still felt like power. Weebles were strange. Round, egg-shaped, plastic, and slightly hypnotic, they had one job: to fall and get back up. And they did. Every time. Weebles wobble but they do not fall down was not just a slogan, it was a promise. You pushed them, you tilted them, you stacked them. But no matter how hard you tried, they would not tip over. Their secret? A weighted bottom that made them bounce right back. And as a kid, that felt like magic. They came in all kinds: clowns, animals, astronauts, families. Some had little playsets. Others stood alone like tiny toys with superpowers. They were cheerful, durable, and weirdly comforting. Even as a toddler, you sensed their message. Things might get rough, but you bounce back. Parents loved them because they were safe. No sharp edges, no small parts, no batteries to replace. Kids loved them because they were unpredictable. You would roll them across the kitchen floor or try to trap them under Tupperware bowls. They were indestructible. They were eternal. And while you might not think about them often now, if you saw one today, you would probably smile. Because those little plastic figures taught you more about resilience than any book ever could. Plastic sofa covers were not a suggestion. They were a law. If your grandparents or parents had a couch they loved, you can bet it was wrapped in thick, crinkly plastic. Not soft, not breathable, just clear, sticky protection against the sins of children, pets, and snack time. You would sit down and instantly stick. Every move made a noise. In summer, it was a trap. In winter, it was a slide. But that plastic was sacred. It kept the real fabric safe. Underneath was often a scratchy floral print untouched for years. No one knew what it felt like, because the covers never came off. Guests, family, even pets were expected to obey the rule. Plastic only. It was like sitting on a giant sheet of packing tape. Every fart noise was unintentional. Every moment slightly uncomfortable. But the goal was clear: preserve the couch forever. And it kind of worked. Some of those covered sofas are still around, still spotless under their shiny armor. Looking back, it seems excessive. Hilarious, even. But in a time when furniture was an investment and messes were constant, plastic covers made sense. Strange sense, but sense all the same. They were a part of the home, for better or stickier. In 1976, everything suddenly turned red, white, and blue. The United States Bicentennial was not just a celebration, it was a full-on marketing explosion. You could not walk through a store without seeing patriotic plates, mugs, coins, or even shampoo bottles branded with stars and stripes. It was not just about pride, it was about collecting. From quarters stamped with a drummer boy to commemorative soda cans and decorative tins, Americans scooped up anything that screamed 1776 to 1976. Kids got coloring books with bald eagles. Adults hung commemorative plates on the wall and bought matching sets of Liberty Bell glasses from the gas station. You might remember paperweights, lunchboxes, and even cereal boxes that joined in. For one shining year, everything in your house looked like it belonged to George Washington's birthday party. And while some saw it as kitschy or overdone, others cherished these pieces. They were physical reminders of a once-in-a-lifetime celebration. Even today, if you find one buried in a drawer or tucked in a box, it hits differently. Not just patriotic, but personal. Because in that moment, the whole country was decorating its memory, and every family had at least one artifact to prove they were part of it. Before microwaves took over the world, there was Jiffy Pop. That iconic silver foil pan with the wire handle looked more like a science experiment than a snack. You placed it over the burner, turned the heat to medium, and waited. First, nothing. Then a rustle. Then a pop. Then a full-on explosion of sound as the silver dome started to rise. It puffed up like magic, growing rounder and louder until it looked like a shiny balloon about to burst. You shook the handle gently, trying not to burn the bottom. The anticipation was everything. Kids gathered around the stove like it was a campfire. Parents pretended not to worry, it might go up in flames. And then it was done. You tore open the top and reached inside, burning your fingers on the edge, of course, for a handful of hot, buttery popcorn. It did not matter if half of it was burnt and the other half still kernels. It was the experience, the ritual. The popcorn was secondary. The fun was in the show. Jiffy Pop was not just a snack. It was a performance. And if you ever had a movie night that started with that sizzling silver pan, you remember the thrill of the balloon. Ice cubes were once a challenge, not a luxury. If you grew up with metal ice cube trays, you know the struggle. These were not the soft plastic kind you could twist. These were cold, clanky, and had a metal lever down the center that always seemed to jam. You filled them carefully, making sure not to spill as you walked them to the freezer. And when you wanted ice, you braced yourself. That lever took strength and guts. Pull it too fast, and ice shards sprayed across the kitchen. Pull it too slow, and it did nothing. There was a sweet spot, and only adults seemed to know it. Sometimes the cube stuck anyway. Sometimes the tray froze shut. And yet, there was something satisfying about the ritual. You felt like you were unlocking a frozen treasure. The sound of the lever cracking through the ice was loud, sharp, and kind of thrilling. Ice cubes never tasted better than when they were earned. Those trays lived in every freezer drawer, slowly rusting, denting, but always doing their job. Replaced now by automatic makers and silicone trays, they are largely forgotten. But for anyone who remembers the clang of metal and the cold burn of the handle, they are a badge of domestic toughness. Saturday morning was a sacred ritual. You rolled out of bed in your pajamas, shuffled to the kitchen, and poured yourself a bowl of cereal, always from a brightly colored box featuring a sugar-charged cartoon mascot. But it was not just about what you poured. It was what you poured it into. Saturday morning cereal bowls were branded, oversized, and beloved. They had the logos, the characters, sometimes even games printed inside. Trix, Fruity Pebbles, Super Sugar Crisp, each had its own bowl. You held it like a trophy. You filled it past the brim. The milk turned a strange color. The spoon clinked loudly. And the real show? It was waiting for you in the living room. Schoolhouse Rock, the Super Friends, the Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner Hour. You balanced the bowl on your knees, dripping milk on the carpet, eyes glued to the screen. Parents still asleep, the sun barely up. This was your time. The cereal was sweet, the cartoons were loud, and the bowl made it official. Some were premiums you mailed away for. Others came as prizes. But they all had one thing in common. They turned breakfast into a weekly holiday. That bowl was not just dishware. It was a ticket to your favorite time of the week. The Sears Wish Book was not just a catalog, it was a dream machine. When that thick holiday edition arrived in the mail, it was like the door to another universe had opened. You grabbed it before anyone else could. You flipped to the toy section immediately, no time for sweaters or tools. The pages were glossy, the pictures were perfect. There were action figures, dollhouses, bikes, race car tracks, and board games stacked in impossible abundance. You circled your favorites with a crayon. You wrote your name next to them, like that would make a difference. You made lists. You dropped hints. You dreamed big. And even if you knew you would not get half the things in there, that never stopped the hope. The Wish Book was a fantasy, but it felt real. It made December feel closer. It made you believe. It was not just for kids either. Parents pored over it too, marking pages, planning budgets, whispering over breakfast about what might be possible. The book itself got worn and creased, pages torn, the toy section barely holding on. But it stayed on the coffee table all season long, because sometimes just wishing was enough. And in the 1970s, that one catalog carried a whole generation's hopes between its pages. Made-for-television movies in the 1980s were not just filler. They were events. Whole nights were planned around them. When that promo would come on, this Sunday, only on ABC, you would perk up, lean in, and make mental notes to not miss it. This was before DVR, before pause buttons. You missed it? You missed it. These movies had titles like The Day After, V, The Final Battle, or The Ewok Adventure. Some were tearjerkers, some were thrillers, some were straight-up terrifying, and they had you glued to the screen, wondering how they managed to squeeze so much drama into 2 hours. Plus, commercials. Families would make popcorn, dim the lights, and treat it like it was an actual premiere. You watched it live together, and you talked about it the next day at school, because chances were everyone saw it too. They hit different. The music, the narration, even that grainy picture, it all added to the mood. You were not just watching, you were part of something. And right in the middle of those movies came the strange intermissions, ones that could go from innocent to haunting in 5 seconds flat. Going to the gas station used to be fun. I am not even kidding. In the 1970s, pulling into a station was not just about filling up the tank, it was about what you got for free. Gas station giveaways were the absolute jackpot of roadside errands. You would get real glassware, like full-on drinking glasses with cartoon characters or sports team logos printed on them. There were dishes, figurines, tiny toys, even aluminum tumblers in wild colors. Some stations had full sets you could collect over time, which meant every gas stop felt like you were unlocking a new piece in the puzzle. Parents would even choose where to fill up based on who had the best freebies that week. And kids? We kept track. We knew which stations had the cool tumblers and which ones were slacking. Sometimes they even gave out trading stamps to go along with your haul, so it was a 2-for-1 deal. You might not remember the cost of gas back then, but you definitely remember that little thrill when the attendant handed over your freebie through the car window. It was like a tiny prize for just living life. But if you think that was exciting, wait until you hear about the one thing that made kids count down the days from summer to winter, flipping through pages and circling dreams. Zodiac-inspired perfume sets had their 15 minutes of fame when New Age culture exploded across America in the 1980s. Suddenly, everything had to do with your astrological sign, your diet, your love life, and yes, even your smell. These perfume kits came packaged in elaborate boxes with swirling star charts and inspirational quotes. Each scent was carefully crafted to represent the energy of a specific sign. Aries got something spicy and bold. Pisces, soft and floral. Sagittarius, something that smelled like sandalwood met a vanilla candle in a crystal shop. It was all a little much. The problem? The scents were too specific. You could not just wear whatever. You were expected to commit to your Zodiac scent like it was your spiritual destiny. And worst of all, the trend did not last. Once the New Age boom simmered down, so did the demand for Virgo body mist. The boxes were bulky, the fragrances had a short shelf life, and it turned out people would rather smell good than smell astrologically accurate. These perfume sets became novelty gifts and gag presents long before they were cleared from store shelves. But if you thought niche perfume was a strange mashup, let us take a seat, literally, in one of the worst household design ideas to ever blast soft rock from under your butt. Atari was not just a console. It was the moment you realized you could control what was on the screen. That beige plastic box with its wood-grain front was a rite of passage. You plugged in a cartridge, held a joystick with one red button, and disappeared into a world of blocky spaceships and endless beeping. Pong, Centipede, adventure. But nothing haunted us quite like the E.T. game. A confusing labyrinth of pits, pixels, and frustration. It was one of the first times we learned that not every game had a happy ending. We still tried, over and over, because we believed it should make sense. The magic of Atari was not in how good the games were. It was how new it all felt, how unreal it was to be the one moving the little guy on the screen. Kids today boot up hyper-realistic games in seconds. But back then, we waited for the television to warm up, adjusted the antenna, and prayed for no static. You only had one game at a time, and that was enough. Just like how every living room had one couch, always covered in a thick plastic shell that crinkled when you sat down, like it was protecting something too precious to ever be touched. Before Fandango or streaming apps told us what was playing, there was the operator, and calling the theater was an event in itself. You would dial a number, usually a long one, and wait as a robotic voice or sometimes an actual person listed off every movie and showtime like it was the State of the Union. Showtimes for the weekend of July 24th, Gremlins at 7:30, The Goonies at 9:15, Ghostbusters at 10:45. You could not skip ahead. You had to listen. Carefully. And maybe even write it down if you were planning a big night. If someone in the house picked up the phone while you were listening, forget it. You had to start over. And if you called during a busy hour, good luck hearing anything over the static and background noise. But it was still exciting. The build-up, the anticipation. You felt like you were about to join something important, something bigger than yourself. Because back then, watching a movie meant going somewhere. It meant tickets, seats, sticky floors, and that one kid who always threw popcorn. It meant magic. But if you wanted movie magic at home, you did not need a theater. You just needed to clear your schedule, grab the good blanket, and stake your claim on the couch. Halloween in the 1970s was not a trip to a pop-up shop for a $30 superhero suit. It was a challenge, a test of creativity, a race to see who could turn a cardboard box and some tinfoil into a full-blown astronaut helmet or a robot torso. You begged your parents for old clothes, rummaged through closets for anything with a weird texture, and repurposed kitchen utensils into alien antennas. And then there were the masks. You know the ones. Thin plastic with elastic bands that snapped after 2 wears, tiny eye holes that never lined up with your face, and a mouth slit so small you could not breathe without fogging up the inside. But still, when it came time to trick or treat, you felt invincible. You became someone else. There was pride in a homemade costume. Nobody else on the block had it. You made it, with your own hands, or with your parents' help after dinner. And if your costume got torn or the rain made the paint run, you just kept going. Candy was candy, rain or shine, store-bought or not. But if you really wanted to earn something sweet, and not just from a pillowcase haul, you had to do a little hustling of your own. That meant going door to door, not for candy, but for glass bottles. Laserdisc karaoke machines for home use were the audio equivalent of bringing a jet engine to a dinner party. These bulky systems promised a high-tech singing experience complete with massive laser discs that looked like vinyl records from the future. They came with tiny microphones, video lyrics, and a catalog of songs that somehow made every living room feel like a karaoke bar at 2 a.m., and not in a good way. The disc-changing process was awkward. The song selection was dated even for the time, and the video footage that played behind the lyrics often looked like someone filmed it in a dentist's waiting room. The microphones were low quality, the volume controls were chaotic, and the speakers distorted your voice into a shrill echo that could wake the neighbors. And not in a fun, come join us way. They were expensive, heavy, and quickly became outdated once smaller, sleeker, and more user-friendly CD-based systems rolled in. But if you thought singing poorly to a crowd of annoyed relatives was bad, imagine trying to impress someone with your personality, through perfume that matched your horoscope sign. Metal lunchboxes were not just about food, they were about identity. You could walk into the cafeteria and know exactly who someone was based on what they carried. E.T., Strawberry Shortcake, the A-Team, Knight Rider. These lunchboxes were loud, colorful, and always had a matching thermos inside that smelled like forgotten spaghetti by lunchtime. They would dent within a week, chip their paint after one drop, and clatter so loudly on the table it turned heads. The thermos lid doubled as a cup. The soup inside never stayed hot. And if your sandwich was packed next to a leaky pudding cup, you were in for a lunchtime surprise. Still, they were magic. Opening one was like unlocking your own personal vending machine. Even if all you had was a peanut butter sandwich and a bruised apple, it felt like more, because it was yours. You would trade parts of your lunch based on the power of your box. A Transformers box? That gave you leverage. A generic one? Not so much. Over time, plastic replaced the metal. Characters faded, designs got cheaper. And today, most kids eat out of brown paper bags or insulated packs with no soul. But once upon a time, what you brought to lunch said everything about you. And what you wore on the way there? That said even more. Owning a Trapper Keeper in the 1980s felt like owning a briefcase made just for kids, but with neon colors, Velcro, and personality. These were not just folders. These were statements. You did not just store your homework in a Trapper Keeper. You stored your identity. From bold geometric designs to wild illustrations of race cars, dolphins, or laser grids that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie, the outside of your Trapper Keeper said something about you. And that satisfying rip of the Velcro? That was music. It had pockets for pencils, slots for notes, compartments you never used but felt cooler just knowing they were there. There was something so absurdly organized about them that it made you want to turn your life into a schedule. You would write the dates on your notebook dividers, color code your subjects, and then forget all of it by Wednesday. But hey, the effort was there. You felt important carrying one around. It made you feel like you were growing up, And even if you never opened it for anything other than doodling weird cartoons during math class, it still felt like a win. But when it came to keeping track of things, there was one object that really made you feel like a collector. And not just of stuff, but of memories. Paper routes were the ultimate crash course in growing up. It was not just a side gig. It was a rite of passage. You would get up before the sun, sometimes before your parents were even awake, pull on your jacket, and head out with that thick canvas shoulder bag that nearly dragged on the ground. The newspapers were heavy, especially on Sundays. You would roll and rubber band them the night before or as you went, if you were brave. There was a rhythm to it. Walking house to house, tossing them just right so they landed near the door but not in the bushes. You knew which neighbors tipped, which ones complained, and which ones pretended they were not home when it came time to collect. And that was the part no one warned you about, the collection. You had to knock on doors, smile politely, and ask for your money. It was awkward. It was humbling. But it made you feel grown. You earned something. And if you saved up enough, you could finally buy that thing you had been eyeing for months. A new bike, a radio, or maybe a toy. But not just any toy. We are talking about the weirdest, creepiest, most unforgettable toy of the era. One with disguises, glue-on features, and a face you could never forget. Let's talk about Hugo, Man of 1,000 Faces. The Garbage Pail Kids movie is the textbook example of a terrible idea being taken way too seriously. The trading cards were already controversial. Gross-out humor, exaggerated features, bodily functions turned into punchlines. But they were iconic. So naturally, someone decided to turn them into a full-length feature film. And it was a mess. The characters were played by little people in horrifying animatronic masks that barely moved, giving every scene a nightmarish vibe. The plot? A vague attempt at a coming-of-age story with elements of science fiction and slapstick comedy, all of it soaked in questionable effects and even worse acting. Even die-hard fans of the cards walked out of theaters feeling like they had just lost a piece of their childhood. Critics called it one of the worst films ever made, and audiences agreed. It tanked at the box office, vanished from theaters, and was quietly swept under the rug. The only thing this movie managed to accomplish was proving that not all nostalgia belongs on the big screen. But if you think that was a bitter taste, just wait until we talk about a candy bar that tried to be classy and ended up at the bottom of the vending machine. Dinner used to come in a foil tray, divided like a tiny apartment. Meat in one corner, peas in another, and a brownie that either scorched your mouth or stayed frozen in the middle. TV dinners were not gourmet, but they were futuristic. You would peel back the foil, pop it in the microwave, and wait. That hum meant convenience, progress, and independence. It was not just about saving time. It was about having your own meal, your own space, your own show to eat in front of. Salisbury steak swimming in salty brown sauce, mashed potatoes with a swirl that never mixed right, peas that tasted like metal but looked bright green enough to fool you, and the brownie, always, always the brownie. It was a meal designed by science and nostalgia, all wrapped up in tin. Somewhere along the way, microwaves got faster, portions got smaller, and we traded sections for squeeze pouches. But the memory of that shiny tray, pulled hot from the microwave and placed carefully on a plastic tray table, never really left. Just like the jewelry you wore to dinner that clicked, clacked, and told your whole personality one charm at a time. Back before virtual reality, Viewmaster reels were the closest thing to teleportation we had. A small red plastic viewer, chunky and indestructible, that you held up to your face like some kind of sci-fi binoculars. But inside, whole worlds waited. You'd flick the lever with your thumb and instantly jump from a still frame of Mount Rushmore to a three-dimensional jungle scene with elephants that felt like they could walk right out of the frame. Some reels were cartoons, others were travel photos, some were straight-up educational, which somehow made you like them even more. They were quiet, simple, and personal. You did not share your Viewmaster. That was yours. A private little universe. Every kid had their favorite reel. Maybe it was the one with dinosaurs. Maybe it was the space shuttle. Whatever it was your escape hatch from a math worksheet or a rainy Saturday. The 1980s weren't about flashy screens or downloads. They were about plastic, paper, light, and wonder. And somehow, that was enough. Actually, it was more than enough. But if you really wanted to feel like you were holding the future in your hands, you did not stop at a Viewmaster. You went for the gadget that talked back. Before recycling was trendy, it was profitable. At least if you were a kid in the 1970s with ambition and a wagon. You could walk up and down the block knocking on doors, asking neighbors if they had any bottles to spare. Not water bottles. We are talking glass soda and milk bottles, sturdy, heavy, and returnable. Stores gave you money for them. Not a lot, but enough. A nickel here, a dime there. If you collected enough, you could walk away with a whole $1. And in 1970s kid currency, that was like a small fortune. You could buy a comic book, a candy bar, a slushie, or save up for something even bigger. You felt responsible, independent, even a little proud. Sure, your hands smelled like old soda, and the glass sometimes had gunk in it, but that did not matter. You were earning. This was how kids learned hustle. Before allowances and debit cards, you had to get creative, and when the work was done, you went home, sat cross-legged on the shag carpet, and turned on the television to that one channel you could never quite explain. Fashion in the 1980s did not whisper, it screamed. On your feet were jellies, those translucent plastic shoes that felt like walking on rubber bands and smelled like a new toy aisle. On your shirts, colors that changed with your body heat. Hypercolor magic that turned purple when you sweated in gym class or clashed wildly with everything else you were wearing. And on your sneakers, Velcro. Lots and lots of Velcro. Not because you could not tie laces, but because Velcro was cool. It snapped open. It snapped shut. It made noise when you moved. These were not just trends. They were signals. You were part of the world now. You were growing up. Even if your jellies gave you blisters. Even if your shirt never changed back to blue. You wore it anyway because it made you feel like part of something big and bright and new. But somewhere in the closet of your memory, these styles got boxed up and left behind. They do not show up in vintage shops. They do not make sense on paper. But you remember them. You felt them. And sometimes, you wish you could wear them again. Just to feel that wild, fearless energy. The kind you had when even dinner felt like a science experiment in metal trays with tiny compartments and a brownie that burned your tongue. The greatest performers of the 1970s did not always have their names on marquees. Sometimes they were just the neighborhood kids putting on a backyard circus or a homemade talent show. And it was epic. Someone would make a hand-drawn poster using crayons and tape it to every mailbox on the street. Another kid would bring out a wobbly card table and pretend to sell tickets. You had gymnasts flipping through hula hoops, magicians fumbling through card tricks, and singers belting out radio hits into a hairbrush. If you had a dog that could sit, that dog was now part of the act. And your little brother? He was definitely going to be the assistant, whether he liked it or not. These shows were never perfect. Costumes fell apart, music cut out, and someone always cried halfway through. But it did not matter. The parents sat on folding chairs or blankets in the grass and clapped like they were at Radio City Music Hall. It was community. It was chaos. It was childhood. And when the show was over, the kids would bow, proud and breathless. But the moment you stepped back inside the house, another kind of performance was underway, trying to sneak in a private phone call when the entire household was listening in. MTV in the 1980s was not just a channel, it was a movement. The second you heard that iconic, "I want my MTV," you knew you were about to step into another world. A world where music lived on your screen, not just your speakers. Where your favorite artist could become a visual legend. It played music videos, actual music videos, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That meant you could go from watching Cyndi Lauper dancing through city streets to seeing Michael Jackson turn into a werewolf without ever leaving your couch. Music became cinematic. Performances became stories. Seeing someone on TV who made you feel like you were not the only weirdo out there. And maybe, just maybe, being a weirdo was cool. MTV introduced you to bands you never heard of, genres you never explored, and visuals that burned into your brain like neon on wet pavement. You would tape videos, argue over countdowns, and swear that your favorite video was art. But when you got back to school, it was back to basics, and one look at your folder would say everything your mouth could not. You did not earn Scratch-and-sniff stickers. You survived for them. They were tiny, circular, and usually smelled like something familiar, but just a little off. Root beer that smelled too sweet. Pizza that somehow had a hint of crayon. And then, of course, the mysterious ones labeled yuck or gross that every kid lined up to sniff, gag, and laugh at. Teachers kept them in secret drawers like treasures. You never saw them hand one out casually. No, these were rewards for a perfect spelling test, a cleaned desk, or just being quiet when the class got loud. You would stick them onto your folder or your pencil case and guard them like gold. Some kids had entire sticker books dedicated to collecting and trading them. And yes, there were rules. No scratching too hard. No peeling it off someone else's desk. No faking a smell just to fit in. It sounds silly now, but back then, it was currency. A root beer sticker meant you were doing something right. A mystery stink meant you had status. They faded over time. The smells wore off. The adhesive dried up. But even now, if someone mentions scratch and sniff, you know exactly what they are talking about. And that memory is still sharp. Like the clang of something else you carried proudly in your hands, covered in cartoon heroes heavy as a brick and always leaking tomato soup. Yes, this really happened. Coca-Cola made clothes, as in actual clothing. Jackets, shirts, and sweatshirts plastered with the iconic Coca-Cola logo, sometimes in cursive so dramatic it looked like a roller coaster had crashed into a soda can. The Coke clothing line hit malls hard in the 1980s, banking on the brand's popularity in that sweet spot between streetwear and soda culture. The problem? Nobody really knew how to wear it. Were you supposed to match it with jeans, with joggers, with a giant can of Coca-Cola in hand for authenticity? You had to really love Coke, not just drink it, but live it. And for the majority of people, that was asking way too much. The line did okay for a hot second in teen catalogs and discount racks, but beyond that, total fizzle. It never became a lasting trend, and the clothes aged about as well as a soda left open on the counter. Retro charm can only go so far. And while we're on the subject of old-school gadgets trying to reinvent themselves, let us talk about the time Viewmaster thought it could compete with video games, and failed faster than you can say, click to turn. Saturday mornings in the 1970s were sacred. You did not sleep in. You woke up early, grabbed the biggest bowl you could find, filled it with sugary cereal, and plopped down in front of the television. This was not just a casual routine. It was a ritual. You only had a few golden hours before the grown-up programs kicked in, and every second counted. The lineup? Legendary. Looney Tunes, Scooby-Doo, the Super Friends, the Jetsons. But nestled between the slapstick and sound effects were something sneakier. Public service announcements. You would be watching Bugs Bunny one minute, and the next, a little cartoon light bulb wearing sneakers would hop on screen singing, "I'm just a Bill." Suddenly, you were learning about how laws were made and the importance of brushing your teeth, all while still chewing on marshmallow shapes. And somehow, it worked. Time for Timer told you about cheese and crackers. Schoolhouse Rock gave you grammar. These messages were as much a part of your childhood as the shows themselves. They blended right into the backdrop of your Saturday, like static in between the channels. You did not always understand them, but you remembered them. And as soon as you heard the first jingle in the distance, the real fun began. Because there was something coming that could get every kid off the couch in seconds. Taping songs off the radio was a sacred mission. You would sit for hours next to your boombox, finger hovering over the record button, praying that the next song would be the one. And when it was, you had one shot to catch it clean, no static, no interruptions, and above all, no DJ talking over the intro. But of course, they always did. The opening notes would hit, your heart would race, and just as you hit record, that was the latest from Madonna. Coming up next, we've got... And just like that, your perfect mixtape moment was ruined. You would yell at the radio like the DJ could hear you. Why? Why do you do this to me? It was a battle of timing and nerves. Some kids got sneaky and recorded during the night shift when the hosts were quieter. Others became masters of timing, predicting when the chorus would drop, when the ad break would hit. It took real skill. And even if you missed a few seconds of the intro, you still labeled the tape like it was gold. You were not just building a playlist, you were capturing a moment. Free music, sure, but earned through effort, patience, and pure willpower. And if you were serious about your song collection, you were not stopping at one track. You were building an entire soundscape, one emotional banger at a time. If one of these forgotten treasures brought back a memory you had not felt in decades, tell us in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe so we can keep digging up the pieces of your past.